I'd like to now call up Father Flannery to introduce Michael Waldstein.
It's my great pleasure to introduce to you my friend of many years, Professor Michael Waldstein of Ave Maria University in Florida. Professor Waldstein's talk is entitled Rereading Thomas Aquinas with Dietrich von Hildebrand, Value and the Transcendence of Nature. Professor Waldstein is extremely well suited to address such a theme or combination of themes. Like few other scholars, Professor Waldstein can truly be called a pontifex, a bridge builder, although pontifex with a small p. He has an amazing breadth of interest and sympathetic knowledge. He has worked in and that is with the texts of Thomas Aquinas. He's worked on especially the New Testament, the Gospel of St. John. He's worked on Hans Urs von Balthasar, also Dietrich von Hildebrand. I recall some 25 years ago, we were part of a seminar, privately organized seminar in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The seminar was on Thomas Aquinas' commentary on the Gospel of St. John, I believe, and I remember also that in this seminar, we spoke as much about Shakespeare as we did about St. John or Thomas Aquinas. So it's just an indication of his breadth of knowledge and interest. Professor Waldstein is the son of Professor Wolfgang Waldstein, if I'm not mistaken, who is well known here in Rome, an expert in Roman law, and participant in many, or member of a number of councils and other institutes here in Rome. He did his undergraduate degree at Thomas Aquinas College in California. He did a doctorate in philosophy at the University of Dallas. Afterwards, he went to the Pontifical Biblical Institute, that is the prestigious Pontifical Biblical Institute, and that's our Jesuit, and after that did a doctorate, that is a THD at Harvard Divinity School, which is also quite prestigious. After just very briefly to mention some of the various stages in his teaching career, he taught at Notre Dame for several years at as part of the program in liberal studies. He was the founding president of the International Theological Institute in Gaming, Austria, and is presently, as I have mentioned, at Ave Maria, where he is the Max Seckler Professor of Theology. I might mention finally that he's also a husband and a father of 8 children, in which role he functions also, I'm very sure, as pontifex. Yes.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. I owe to Dietrich von Hildebrand a very great debt of gratitude. Most fundamentally for my existence, not as directly as you do, but indirectly. My parents met through his mediation in the home of the Seifert family, where my mother was trying to keep in line my predecessor here at the podium. She was an au pair girl from Switzerland. And my parents were deeply formed by Dietrich von Hildebrand. So I drank in his philosophy and his spirituality with my mother's milk and my father's beer. When And I'm very grateful for that. That has remained with me and has become more important as time goes on, the more I realize the wealth contained in that heritage. When I decided in 1972 to attend Thomas Aquinas College, Hildebrand took me aside to warn me of the principal errors of St. Thomas. There were a good many in the list, but I will focus only on the following four. We might have time to talk in the question and answer about others. I've been working on them. Those are the ones most immediately relevant to the topic of love. The first one is that the good is the full actuality of a nature and is therefore always a good for a particular nature. Professor Seifert put it in terms of objective good for rather than value. Secondly, the will is defined as the rational appetite, appetitus rationalis, on the model of sub-personal and natural urges. Thirdly, love is reduced to an appetitus, an appetite, that is rooted in the nature of the will. And fourth, happiness is the unavoidable end of human life, and only the means to it are chosen. Now, today I'm convinced that these four errors, as Hildebrand understands them, are not to be found in St. Thomas. He understands the phrases that are like those of St. Thomas quite differently. It seems to me an urgent task for the good of Catholic intellectual life to overcome these apparent disagreements. They are, I think, they do damage both to both traditions. And in my talk today, what I would like to do is reread some texts of St. Thomas with Hildebrand, not against him, with Hildebrand. That is, to read them with eyes and ears opened by Hildebrand's way of seeing and speaking, in order to see the deep agreement between him and St. Thomas. I think he could have had a similar love for St. Thomas as for St. Anselm, and I think we would understand St. Thomas more deeply if that were the case, given his insight. Let me begin with the following text from Christian Ethics. The capacity to transcend himself is one of man's deepest characteristics. So long as we consider his activities as the mere unfolding of his entelechy, determined by his nature, or as immanent manifestations of principles proper to his nature, we fail to grasp the most distinctive feature of his character as a person. Man cannot be understood if we interpret all his activities as manifestations of an automatic striving for self-perfection. So long as we're confined to this pattern, so long as we see man differing from other beings only by the fact that their objective teleological tendency assumes in him a character of consciousness, we overlook the real nature of man as a person. It is not an immanent movement, unconscious or conscience, which is man's typical mark. Certainly, this also is to be found in man's nature, in the physiological sphere as well as in the psychical. But the specifically personal character of man as a subject manifests itself in his capacity to transcend himself. In all immanent trends to unfold our nature, our attitude has the character of self-affirmation, Whereas in every value response, our attitude has the basic feature of self-donation. This came out very strongly and clearly in Professor Seifert's talk. Let me now reflect about this text. The key concepts Hildebrand uses to describe St. Thomas's account are nature, entelechy, appetitus, and telos, or end. The nature of a being determines its entelechy by providing a blueprint of what a being is supposed to be. The entelechy, as Hildebrand understands that term, is an inner impulse toward realizing the blueprint. And this impulse, in turn, expresses itself as a set of particular appetites, appetitus, for the end. And the end, in turn, is simply the realization of the blueprint, the full actuality of a being. Given a particular inclination or appetitus toward the end, dictated by a thing's nature and entelechy, some objects outside a being turn out to be suitable to serve that end. They help in the unfolding of the entelechy. A cat, for example, plays with a ball of wool. Its interest in the ball depends on the urge or appetite to unfold its own entelechy. The ball is important for the cat because the cat happens to have this particular entelechy. For a snail, the ball of wool does not have this importance. The entelechy is the principium, as Hildebrand likes to put it, that is the beginning, the starting point. The importance of the ball is the principiatum, that is that which comes from the beginning and depends on it. In itself, the ball is indifferent. It remains indifferent to the snail, and it becomes important for the cat without having, for all that, any importance or goodness in itself. Now, a quote from The Nature of Love. In all needs, this desire, Verlangen, is the principium, and the object, the principiatum. While in all responses, the object is the principium, and the attitude of the person, the principiatum. All needs are founded upon the nature of man, and the object becomes important because the need already exists, regardless of what importance the object possesses in itself. Here, the importance of the object for man is founded upon the quality of the object being able to appease his need. If the need, the drive, the appetitus were not alive already, the same object which now has a power of attraction would have no power of attraction at all and would not stand before us as important. It is because we are thirsty that we want water. Thirst is clearly not a response to the water. And still continuing the quote, the decisive difference between an appetitus and a value response is first, that in a value response the importance of the object does not consist in satisfying a need of the person, subjectively or objectively, but in the importance of the object in itself. In value response, the theme is the value of the good. In appetitus, by contrast, the theme is the satisfaction of a need, that is, the unfolding of the subject, for which it necessarily requires a certain thing. That's the end of the quote. And I think many of the points Professor Seifert made clarify exactly what Hildebrand means here. To the degree, therefore, in which something is helpful in appeasing the de facto appetitus of human nature, in furthering the full actualization or unfolding of human nature, or happiness, it becomes important for human beings. Virtue is good, not good in itself, but only good for us, because it corresponds to our nature as a means for fully actualizing it. God is good, not good in himself, but only good for us, because he corresponds to our nature as a means for fully actualizing it, as a means for happiness. I think these are roughly the outlines of Hildebrand's reading of St. Thomas. And I should add that if this were really the position of St. Thomas, I think there's only one word appropriate for it: diabolical. Because it is an ordering of everything, including all other persons and of God, to myself. And that's diabolical. If everything is a means for happiness, if that's the one thing that counts, that's diabolical. So I understand that Hildebrand could not have a love for St. Thomas as he did for St. Anselm. It's fully understandable. I would certainly not have a love for St. Thomas if I thought that's what he said. Now, according to St. Thomas, as I understand him now, almost 40 years after Hildebrand's warning, I think the precise contrary is true. This is, I think, difficult to propose a different reading of St. Thomas, because it's a reading that has been in existence since Max Scheler, so since the early part of the 20th century, for almost 100 years. It's difficult to speak against a reading that is so entrenched. In St. Thomas, good is prior to end. Something is desirable as an end because it is good. Not good because it happens to be desirable for the fulfillment of a particular entelechy. Desirable as an end is an account of the good in terms of an effect. It is not a formal definition of the good. The natures of all beings are designed in such a way that they follow the good and need to be explained in terms of the prior good. The good is the principium, the natures and their appetitus, the principiatum. So the exact opposite. Aristotle and St. Thomas never used the word entelechy in the sense found in Hildebrand. Scheler uses it in this sense based on Hans Driesch, who was the first to develop this precise sense of entelechy. I think this fact is important when one attempts to explain why Hildebrand reads St. Thomas as he does. I think it's a reading inherited from Scheler. Pierre Rousselot, the French Jesuit, I think played an important role in establishing that reading. It's a Kantian reading of St. Thomas. Though I haven't been able to establish yet the relationship between Rousselot and Scheler. The term good, St. Thomas holds, is used analogously in three senses, though contrary to what Dr. Seifert said, the distinctions Hildebrand makes are found as well, but they're not immediately there in this first threefold distinction. But I will come to them. He speaks about the honorable good, the good of pleasure, and the useful. The prime analogate, he says, is the honorable good, the bonum honestum. The good of pleasure is good as the resting and rejoicing of love in some bonum honestum. And the useful good is good as leading to some bonum honestum. And so the bonum honestum is, as the prime analogate, on which the other two senses depend, the key to understanding St. Thomas's account of the good. Therefore, I will focus on it. St. Thomas dedicates an entire question of the Summa to explaining what honestum means in this phrase bonum honestum. But this question is found in a seemingly obscure place, namely the discussion of the parts of temperance in the Secunda Secundae, question 145. St. Thomas's reasons for placing it there will become clear. They become clear in the last article. But I became aware of this text only relatively recently. The issue in the first article is whether the honestum is the same as virtue. The first objection that St. Thomas poses against identifying bonum honestum and virtue sounds very much like Hildebrand's reading of St. Thomas. It seems, St. Thomas says, that the honorable is not identical with virtue. For Cicero says in his Rhetoric that the honorable is what is sought for its own sake. Now, virtue is not sought for its own sake, but for the sake of happiness. For the philosopher says in the Ethics that happiness is the reward of virtue and the end. Therefore, the honorable is not the same as virtue. That's the objection. Before considering St. Thomas's response, it's good to look at the body of the article, which takes as its starting point the definition of the honorable proposed by Isidore of Seville. What is honestas, that is honorable, being honored or honorable, if not an enduring honor that is a state of honor, as it were? That's the definition of Isidore of Seville. But St. Thomas understands the state of honor not as honor actually given in a lasting way, but as the state of being worthy of honor. And therefore he reformulates the definition. It seems, this is quote now, it seems that something is called honestum for this reason, that it is worthy of honor, honore dignum. The Honorable Rocco Buttiglione just came to sit down here in front. Honore dignum. For your work in so many ways. On the basis of this definition of the honorable, St. Thomas constructs the following argument for the identity between the honorable and virtue. He says, honor is owed, debetur, to excellence. Excellentia is the word. The excellence of a human being has most to do with virtue, because virtue is, in Aristotle's definition, quote, the disposition of the perfect for the best. It's clear that St. Thomas has in mind, above all, moral virtue in a broad sense that includes charity, not intellectual virtue, because he holds that only moral virtue can be called virtue without qualification. And so he concludes, and therefore the honorable, properly speaking, refers to the same thing as virtue. In this light, we can turn to the response to the first objection, which further clarifies the meaning of honorable. And remember, the first objection had been, virtue is sought as a means for happiness, but the honorable is what is sought for its own sake. Therefore, virtue is not honorable. It's not the honorable par excellence. As the philosopher says in the Ethics, of things that are sought because of themselves, some are sought only because of themselves and never because of something else, such as happiness, which is the ultimate end, though about the meaning of that word happiness, there are profound differences. Others are sought both because of themselves, inasmuch as they have some aspect of goodness in themselves, even if no other good comes to us through them. Nevertheless, they can be sought also because of something else, inasmuch as they lead us to a more perfect good. In this way, virtues must be sought because of themselves. And now, very interesting language taken from Cicero, who my father in particular loves, and we talked about this text. Language quite similar to that of Hildebrand. This is why Cicero says, there, namely in virtue, is something which attracts us by its own power and draws us by its own dignity. And this is enough for the account of honestum, end of quote. So I think particularly this formulation, by its own power it attracts us, by its own dignity it draws us, shows that Cicero is thinking of an intrinsic good, though there's clearly also a reference to the person for whom the virtue becomes a good, and that comes out in the verbs attracts and draws. Yet precisely in these references to the attracted person, it is clear that the principium of goodness lies in the virtue and not outside it. For example, in the pleasure or joy one derives from the virtue or the fulfillment of some entelechy by it. This identification of the bonum honestum with virtue, St. Thomas says, shouldn't be understood as excluding other goods that are less than virtue, such as health, or goods that are higher, such as God. He says that what is lower than virtue deserves the name honestum mainly as ordered to virtue. And what's higher than virtue, above all God, deserves honor more, but it's further away from our experience. And so virtue, he says, carries the name bonum honestum in some way as its very own name. Here you can already see why the discussion of bonum honestum is found in the Secunda Secundae, though an account still needs to be given why temperance in particular and the parts of temperance. In the second article, St. Thomas uses Dionysius, the Areopagite's account of beauty as a middle term to argue from the identity between honestum and virtue to the identity between the honestum and the beautiful. The text from Dionysius to which St. Thomas refers reads as follows, and I quote, "The supersubstantial beautiful is called beauty, because from itself it gives to all beings, to each in its own way, a share in beauty as the cause of the harmony and splendor of all things." End of quote. When St. Thomas comments on that passage in his commentary on Dionysius, he focuses on two concepts: the concept of harmony, oiarmostia, and of splendor, aglaia, which is the name of Aglaia Ivanovna in The Idiot of Dostoevsky, splendor. These two, he argues, constitute the specific face of beauty, both in the order of bodily appearance and in the spiritual order where spiritual brightness or splendor, together with due proportion, that is oiarmostia, makes for beauty. And on the basis of this account of beauty, he offers the following argument for his conclusion. Spiritual beauty consists in this, that a person's conduct, that is his action, is well proportioned according to the spiritual splendor of reason. This is part of the account of the honorable, which we identified with virtue, since virtue moderates all human things according to reason. And so the honorable is the same as spiritual beauty. This is why St. Augustine says, by nobility or honorableness, I mean intelligible beauty, which we properly say is spiritual. And after this, Augustine adds, quote, there are many beautiful things visible which are less properly called honorable. End of quote. The first objection of this same second article that deals with beauty is interesting because it correlates the honestum with appetitus. And one of the main questions in the discussion between Hildebrand and St. Thomas is the meaning of appetitus. Quoting Cicero, again, St. Thomas says, honestum est quod per se appetitur. The honorable is what is sought for itself. The beautiful, St. Thomas goes on to say, is not described so much as the object of appetitus, but as that whose very appearance pleases us. Now, St. Thomas, responding to that, doesn't deny the difference between the terms good and beautiful and a particular relationship of the word good to appetitus, but nevertheless he draws a connection between them. Quote, the object that moves the appetitus is the good when it is known. Now we take as fitting and good that which appears beautiful in the very knowledge of it. And so Dionysius says, to everyone the beautiful and good are lovable. For this reason, this was the end of quote, Dionysius, now continuing with St. Thomas, for this reason the honorable is itself made desirable inasmuch as it has spiritual beauty. Cicero also says, and again, quote, you see the form and the face of it, as it were, of the noble and honorable. If it itself were seen by the eyes, it would stir up amazing loves, as Plato says of wisdom. We go to the fourth and the last article of this question. That's the point of arrival, and it's the point of arrival of the whole quaestio, and it shows why this extremely important teaching on a question so central to St. Thomas's entire account of the good, metaphysics of the good, is located in such a seemingly obscure place, namely the questions that deal with the parts of the virtue of temperance. The article argues that the name honorable good should be given in particular to temperance because of its spiritual beauty. And St. Thomas seems to have had a particular love for temperance and specifically for sexual purity as a virtue of compelling beauty. I think if St. Francis of Assisi had a preferential love for poverty, St. Thomas had a preferential love for the beauty of purity. And so he advances the thesis that honestas is part of temperance in the sense of attaching particularly to this one virtue as the beautiful virtue par excellence. For example, he brings the objection that justice, and especially political justice, is often what is most honored. That's an objection against saying that purity, and in particular sexual purity, is honorable par excellence. And his answer is that justice doesn't have the same beauty. To see St. Thomas's complete understanding of the beauty of purity, one must also consider what he says about the religious vow of chastity, which is according to him, an aspect of the holocaust of love which defines religious life. Quote, religious life is a kind of holocaust, a whole burnt offering, by which someone totally offers himself and all things that are his to God. I think clearly here we are in contact with the heart of St. Thomas's own sanctity, translated into thought. You notice the term gift of self here in this passage. We are also at a point, I think, of close contact with the concerns of Hildebrand and Pope John Paul II, both of whom had a particular love for the beauty of purity, sexual purity in particular. I think this question de honestate is not an exception in St. Thomas's teaching. It is not a point where, as it were, his sanctity made him see more and allowed him to pass beyond his usual reductionist Aristotelian account of the good. But I think St. Thomas's writings can be interpreted as consistent with this account of the Bonum Honestum. That account shows clearly that St. Thomas sees the good as radically the cause of appetitus, not as dependent on appetitus. And the point at issue is more fundamental, as John Crosby points out very well, I think, than the saying, we love what is good because it is good, it is not good because we love it. This saying holds even when the principle of interest in a thing is only in us, as is the case with something that's desirable only because of the pleasure it gives us, even if in itself it's harmful and shameful. But the dependence of appetites on the good, according to St. Thomas, is more fundamental. To put the point in Hildebrand's terms, the good, according to St. Thomas, is radically the principium of appetitus, and appetitus is radically the principiatum of the good. It is most clearly and immediately the principiatum in the case of the rational appetitus, that is the will, which is based on knowledge of the good as good. The very nature of the rational appetitus, according to St. Thomas, is to be an act that transcends the subject in an apprehension of and supremely in a gift of self, a holocaust, to the intrinsically good and beautiful, as you have it in his understanding of chastity. The will's nature, if one were to put this in Hildebrand's terms, is to be the power for self-transcending value response. Above all, although other things are involved in the will, and I will come to the objective good for the person in a minute. In the sub-rational forms of appetitus, nature is in a more mediate way, that is, in virtue of the Creator's intelligence, a principiatum of the good. So the tree doesn't know the good of its life. This radical dependence of all appetitus on the good is the single most fundamental point, I think, to be made in rereading St. Thomas with Hildebrand. There's an important passage in Hildebrand's Ethics, to which Professor Seifert made reference, in which he distinguishes the subjectively satisfying from value. I want to go over those points and show the convergence with St. Thomas. First, in the case of value, the pleasure and happiness, for Hildebrand, happiness is an affective state, an affective response, which it is not for St. Thomas. It's another thing entirely. So in the case of value, the pleasure and happiness we feel flows from the value. The value is the principium, the pleasure or happiness the principiatum. Delight in a good, because of itself, is closely related to beauty. St. Thomas quotes a passage from Plato in the text already presented above, when he quotes Cicero. Let me return to that. I think it's a very important one. The honorable is itself made desirable inasmuch as it has spiritual beauty. Cicero says, you see the form and the face, as it were, of the honorable. If it itself were seen by the eyes, it would stir up amazing loves, as Plato says of wisdom. That's an abbreviated quote. The full text, which Cicero also quotes, which St. Thomas brings to bear, reads as follows from the Phaedrus. Now beauty, as we have said, shone bright among these visions, and in this world below we apprehend it through the clearest of our senses, clear and resplendent. For sight is the keenest mode of perception, through the body, by which wisdom cannot be seen. What passionate love would she have caused if she had granted us so clear an image of herself to gaze upon, nor any other of those beloved objects? For beauty alone this has been ordained to be most manifest and most beloved. I think the experience of beauty, which is so central to Plato and his account of the good, is eloquently expressed in this passage. St. Thomas knew this passage from Cicero and uses it for his own account of the honorable good. Second, according to Hildebrand, value confronts the person with a claim or a call. It is not left up to our momentary mood whether we give a value its due. The duty of eating chocolate, I think, was Professor Seifert's example. This is perhaps the one point in his lecture that I disagree with. I feel the duty to eat chocolate takes priority over other considerations such as health. And a value imposes on us the obligation to give an appropriate response. The manner in which St. Thomas modifies Isidore's definition of honestum goes exactly in this direction. While Isidore defines honestum as that which receives honor in a permanent way, St. Thomas defines it as that which is permanently worthy of honor, honore dignum. And he says, honor is due to excellence, excellentiae debetur. Hildebrand's due relation, I think, corresponds exactly to St. Thomas's debetur, which means is owed or is due. Third, Hildebrand finds the quality of the call of value well expressed by St. Augustine's statement, and this is again interesting because the same subject, namely chastity, is in question here. The austere beauty of continence was revealed, serene and indeed merry, but not debauched, honorably soliciting me to come to her. And Hildebrand comments on this. The call of an authentic value for an adequate response addresses itself to us in a sovereign, but non-intrusive, sober way. It appeals to our free spiritual center. I think St. Thomas' particular love for the beauty of chastity and for the vow of chastity as a self-oblation to God is, Fourth point. In our response to value, according to Hildebrand, we abandon ourselves and transcend the boundaries of our self-centeredness, while absorption in subjective satisfaction confines us to ourselves. This transcendence is particularly clear in St. Thomas's understanding of the natural love of God above all things. There's a text in the commentary on the sentences where St. Thomas says, in an objection about the love of God above all things, according to St. Bernard, nature is always curved into itself, in se curva est. Therefore, love as a whole is reflected back into the lover, so that whatever he loves it for his own sake. Therefore, he does not love God above himself. And he responds, nature is called curved into itself because it always loves its own good. Nevertheless, it does not follow that the intention of nature rests in this, that the good be its own, but in this, that it is good. Unless it were good for it in some way, nisi sibi esset bonum aliquo modo, either in truth or appearance, it would never love it. Nevertheless, it does not love it because it is its own, quia suum est, but because it is good. For the good is through itself the object of will. Of course, in a Hildebrandian examination of this text, special suspicion would fall immediately on the statement about nature. Unless it were good for it, it would never love it. The suspicion would be that St. Thomas here reduces value to the objective good for the person. And as it happens in that same question, the immediately following objection in the text squarely addresses this point. It speaks about commodum. Norris Clark, in an article Dr. Crosby pointed out to me about Hildebrand's contribution, notes that commodum in Scotus seems to be close to Hildebrand's objective good for the person. This is now what St. Thomas says in the objection. Avicenna says that no action of any nature is generous, liberalis is the word, except that of God, because from every action there follows some commodum for the person acting. And I think commodum one can translate here objective good for the person. In his response, St. Thomas denies that commodum is the ultimate reason for love, that is, the ultimate good intended by love. He says, although some objective good for the person, aliquot commodum, comes to every created agent from its action, it does not follow that this commodum is what is intended, as is clear in the friendship between honorable persons. In conclusion, let me turn to the subtitle of my paper, Value and the Transcendence of Nature. If one understands nature as necessarily curved into itself, as immanent, then transcendence of nature must mean transcending nature, that is, going beyond nature to reach what is good in itself, to reach value. Nature is the sphere of immanence, person the sphere of transcendence. But if one understands nature as the principiatum of the good, of value, as flowing from value as from its principium, as St. Thomas does, then transcendence of nature can refer to a movement deeply interior to nature itself. Nature is self-transcendence toward the intrinsically good for the sake of that good. In fact, Hildebrand, in the text I quoted at the beginning, uses the term nature in that second way as well when he talks about the nature of the person being transcendence. Thank you very much for your attention. Five minutes for discussion. By the way, I published an article of which this states in somewhat slightly developed form the nucleus. If you're interested, you can write me an email and I will send you the article. My email address is michael.waldstein@avemaria.edu. Also, I have 3 chapters of a book that develop the same argument in much more detail, going also into the question of voluntary wrongdoing, which is a big issue between Hildebrand and St. Thomas. But please, your questions. Yeah.
Professor Waldstein, thank you very much for this lecture. I would be definitely very interesting to read the articles, and I think this is really very fundamental for the Hildebrandian tradition to think of what you find in Thomas. My question would be, if we read von Hildebrand, I think it's impossible to give an interpretation of him that would go in the direction of how he understands Thomas. That seems somehow in his philosophy, those what he considered to be errors in St. Thomas are so clearly stated that there could be no misunderstanding. The question is, why is it that in Thomas that there could be such a misunderstanding of Thomas historically? You mentioned some Kantian influence. Is that the whole explanation, or do you find, as someone who knows Thomas so well, some points or maybe passages which can be misunderstood? Because the question, I mean, if you are right on what you say, there is still the second question, how this misunderstanding of Thomas could come about by so intelligent people as Scheller or some other people. So that would be the question. I know it's a difficult question, but maybe if you can at least give some basic points.
I only have a hypothesis about this at this point, but I think further work needs to be done. The one thing I'm absolutely sure about is the crucial importance of Hans Driesch in all of this, whom Scheler quotes a number of times in the context of interpreting Aristotle. Now, Hans Driesch developed, he was a vitalist biologist, and he developed the concept of entelechy explicitly in a post-Cartesian way, that is, without the causality of the good. But Scheler, Hans Driesch is very clear that this is what he's doing and that he's disagreeing with Aristotle. He says Aristotle is wrong in saying that the good as good is a cause in nature. But I want to honor Aristotle, who is nevertheless so great, by using a word, namely entelechy, which in Aristotle means actuality. It doesn't mean at all what it means in Driesch. I want to honor him, giving a totally different content to it. So Driesch has a post-Cartesian account of teleology, and Scheler seems to accept that as the historically accurate reading of Aristotle. I think that's one source. The second source is Pierre Rousselot, who in his book, but that's putative at this point. I haven't found references to Rousselot in Scheler. Rousselot in his book, The Problem of Love in the Middle Ages, distinguishes sharply between two opposite conceptions of love, one of which is based on nature and the other on person. One of them, namely the one on nature, based on nature, involves the immanence of the person within himself, and the other, transcendence and self-gift. In Rousselot, this is based upon a Kantian premise. He says at the beginning of the book that just as it is doubtful that consciousness can ever reach beyond itself to being, so it is doubtful that love can ever be selfless and reach beyond love of self. And then he interprets the whole of St. Thomas's account of love as based upon self-love, where the bonum honestum disappears. And if you read this book, it's not there. St. Thomas's account of the bonum honestum is not there. Now, Rousselot was very famous and seemed to be a reliable witness to St. Thomas. So I think Scheler accepted that reading. And Hildebrand followed, as far as I can see, that Scheler had that reading first. That's demonstrable. And Hildebrand followed Scheler on that without having the occasion, or I don't know why it was not possible at a later point to say, but wait a moment, after Descartes many things happened, and what Rousselot is doing in this post-Kantian account of St. Thomas, this is not St. Thomas. That's putative. That's the end.
To stay on schedule. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.